I never signed anything, so why was my house listed as sold? The email sat open on my laptop screen, the subject line calm and official, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Confirmation of transfer. Closing date scheduled. Property 214 Willow Creek Drive. My home. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the keyboard. Not moving, not reacting, just still. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, landing softly on the countertop I had wiped down just an hour earlier, when everything still felt normal. Safe. That word echoed in my mind in a way that felt almost mocking now. Safe. I had woken up at 6:30 a.m., just like I had for the past 20 years, brewed my coffee in the same old machine that hummed a little too loudly, and stood by the sink watching the quiet street outside. Nothing had seemed out of place. Nothing had warned me that something had already shifted, that something had been moving quietly behind my back, rearranging the foundation of my life while I was still standing in it. I clicked on the email again, rereading the details slower this time, as if the words might change if I gave them enough patience. They didn't. The sender was a real estate office I vaguely recognized. The language was precise, polite, and completely certain. There was no question in it. No hesitation. Whoever wrote this believed the transaction was already done. I inhaled slowly, then exhaled steady, controlled. I didn't call anyone. I didn't react the way people expect you to react when something like this happens. I just closed the laptop halfway and let it sit there, like a door I wasn't ready to open yet. Because somewhere, beneath the confusion, there was a quieter thought forming. If I hadn't signed anything, then someone else had. And that meant this wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. I heard footsteps coming down the hallway, light and familiar. Daniel. He always walked a little heavier when he was thinking, a habit he'd had since he was a boy. I straightened slightly in my chair, my expression settling into something neutral before he even entered the room. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice casual like any other day. He poured himself coffee without asking, reaching for the same mug he always used when he visited. Nothing about him seemed different. That was the part that made it harder to process. "Morning," I replied, my voice even. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone for a moment before glancing up at me. "So, have you thought more about the move?" he asked, as if we had already been having that conversation. As if I had somehow missed an entire chapter of my own life. I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something, guilt, hesitation, anything that might explain the gap between what I knew and what he believed I knew. There was nothing obvious. Just a calm expectation. "What move?" I asked quietly. He paused just for a second. It was small, the kind of pause most people wouldn't notice. But I did. Because in that brief moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something closer to recalculation. "The house, Mom," he said a little more carefully now. "We talked about this. Downsizing. Making things easier for you. Easier." I let the word settle between us. It sounded generous. Thoughtful even. But it didn't match the email still glowing faintly on my screen. "I don't remember agreeing to anything," I said. My tone didn't change. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just placed the truth in the space between us and waited to see what he would do with it. Daniel exhaled softly, setting his phone down. "You've had a lot on your mind lately," he said. "It's understandable if you don't remember all the details. Rachel and I have been helping coordinate things." Rachel. Of course. Her name entered the room before she did. I felt it before I saw her, that quiet, controlled presence she carried with her. She stepped into the kitchen a moment later, her expression warm, practiced. "Good morning," she said, offering me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We didn't want to overwhelm you with paperwork," she continued, moving to stand beside Daniel. "So we handled most of it. It's all for the best." For the best. Another phrase that sounded kind on the surface. I nodded slowly as if I were absorbing what they were saying, as if I were trying to catch up to a conversation that had been happening without me. Inside, something was becoming clearer. Not louder. Just sharper. "I see," I said. And I did. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough to understand that whatever had been set in motion, it hadn't started this morning. It had been building quietly, step by step, decision by decision, while I was still standing in my kitchen believing everything was exactly where it had always been. I reached for my coffee, taking a small sip, letting the warmth ground me in the moment. Across from me, my son and his wife stood close together, united in something they thought I didn't understand. Maybe they believed I would panic. Maybe they expected confusion, resistance, questions. I gave them none of that. Because the truth was, I didn't need to react right away. Not yet. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing at all. And as I sat there, in the home they believed was no longer mine, I realized something else. They thought this was already over. They thought the decision had been made. They thought I was the last to know. And that was exactly why they were about to make their first mistake. I did not mention the email again that morning, and neither did they. The kitchen returned to its quiet rhythm, the kind that feels ordinary only when nothing has been taken from it yet. Daniel finished his coffee, rinsed his mug, and placed it carefully in the drying rack as if that small act could prove something about normalcy. Rachel moved through the space with practiced ease, opening cabinets, checking her phone, adjusting things that did not need adjusting. I watched them the way you watch something you are trying to understand without letting it know you are studying it. There was a pattern to their movements, a subtle coordination that had not been there before, or perhaps it had been there for longer than I realized. "We have a few calls today," Rachel said lightly, glancing toward Daniel. "Just to finalize everything." Finalize. Another word that sounded harmless on the surface. I nodded once, as if it did not concern me. "Of course," I said. Daniel gave me a small, reassuring smile, the kind he used when he was a child trying to convince me that he had not broken something. "It will make things easier for you, Mom," he added. Easier. The same word again, repeated like a line rehearsed too many times. I stood from my chair and carried my cup to the sink, rinsing it slowly, feeling the cool water run over my fingers. I had spent decades in this kitchen. I knew every sound it made, every place where the light shifted differently depending on the time of day. But as I stood there, something felt slightly off, like a familiar song played at the wrong speed. When I turned around, I noticed it. A small device mounted high in the corner near the ceiling. It was new. I was certain of that. "When did that get there?" I asked, nodding toward it. Rachel followed my gaze and smiled easily. "Oh, that? Just a little security camera." Daniel thought it would be good for peace of mind. Peace of mind. I looked at Daniel. He avoided my eyes for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Just being careful," he said. I did not respond right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel its weight. "I see," I said finally. And I did. Not just the camera, but what it represented. A house I had lived in for over 30 years, slowly becoming something I no longer fully recognized. I walked down the hallway a few minutes later, my steps unhurried, my expression unchanged. The walls were lined with photographs I had placed there myself over the years. Birthdays, holidays, small moments that once felt permanent. I paused in front of one of them, a picture of Daniel at 10 years old, missing his front tooth, smiling as if the world had never given him a reason not to. I wondered when that version of him had learned to stand in my kitchen and speak about my life as if I were not part of the decision. I continued toward my bedroom, pushing the door open gently. At first glance, everything seemed the same. The bed was made. The curtains were half drawn. But then I noticed the dresser. One of the drawers was slightly open. I walked closer and pulled it out. Inside, the documents I always kept there were not arranged the way I left them. Some were missing entirely. I closed the drawer slowly, my hand resting on the wood for a moment longer than necessary. I did not call out. I did not ask questions. There would be time for that later if I decided it was necessary. For now, I needed to understand the shape of what had been done. As I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear Rachel's voice from the living room, low and controlled, speaking into her phone. I did not move closer, but I listened just enough to catch a few words. "Yes, everything is on track," she said. "We just need to make sure the timeline stays tight." There was a pause. "No, she does not suspect anything." I felt something settle inside me then. Not panic, not anger, but clarity. The kind that comes when a puzzle finally begins to form a picture you cannot ignore. I walked past the living room without letting my footsteps change pace, as if I had not heard a thing. When Rachel ended the call and looked up, I met her eyes briefly and offered a small, polite smile. She returned it instantly, seamless, practiced. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Everything is fine," I replied. And in a way it was. Because now I understood something I had not understood when I first read that email. This was not a sudden decision. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a process. Quiet. Deliberate. Carried out in pieces small enough that I would not notice until it was already complete. They had been moving around me, adjusting my life, rewriting it, all while I continued living in it as if nothing had changed. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not needed to call in years. I did not press it yet. I simply looked at it, considering the weight of what came next. Because the truth was, they were not entirely wrong about one thing. Things were about to change, just not in the way they expected. By the afternoon, the house had settled into a quiet that no longer felt comforting. It was not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that follows something being rearranged without permission. I moved through each room slowly, not searching for anything specific, but letting my eyes rest on details I had once taken for granted. The living room looked the same at first glance, but the coffee table had been shifted slightly to the left, just enough to change the balance of the space. A stack of papers sat neatly aligned near the edge, documents I did not recognize. I did not touch them. Not yet. I simply noted their presence the way one notices a piece on a chessboard that has been moved while you were not looking. From the hallway, I could hear Daniel speaking again, his voice low, measured. I did not try to catch every word this time. I only needed to understand the tone. Controlled. Careful. As if every sentence had already been decided before it was spoken. When he stepped into the living room and saw me standing there, he paused for a fraction of a second before softening his expression. "Mom," he said, "we were just going over some details. Nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing you need to worry about." I nodded, as if that settled everything. "Of course," I replied. "You always take care of things." The words sounded simple, even appreciative, but I watched how they landed. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his shoulders tightening just enough to betray that he had heard something beneath them. Rachel entered a moment later, her phone still in her hand, her smile already in place. "We are trying to make this transition smooth," she said. "There are a lot of moving parts, but everything is under control." Transition. Another word added to the list. I wondered how many more there were. Carefully chosen, rehearsed, repeated until they felt natural enough to pass without question. I walked toward the window, resting my hand lightly against the frame as I looked out at the yard. The oak tree in the corner had been there longer than anything else on the property. It had seen every version of this family, every season, every quiet change that no one noticed until it was already complete. "When is the closing?" I asked, my voice steady, my eyes still on the tree. The room went still behind me. I could feel it without turning around. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked after a moment. I turned then, meeting his eyes directly. "The house," I said. "If everything is already in motion, there must be a date." Rachel was the first to respond. "We are still finalizing the timeline," she said smoothly. "Nothing has been set in stone yet." Set in stone. I almost smiled at that. "I see," I said again. It was becoming a useful phrase. It allowed them to believe I was following along, while giving me the space to observe what they chose to reveal and what they tried to keep hidden. Daniel stepped closer, his tone softening. "We did not want to overwhelm you," he said. "You have been through a lot. This is just the next step." The next step. I studied his face, searching for the boy I had raised, the one who once asked me before making even the smallest decision. He was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of careful words and shared glances, but he was quieter now, overshadowed by something else. Something that had learned to move without me. "I understand," I said, and this time I meant it. Not the way they thought I did, but in a different, more complete way. I understood that whatever had been planned was already far enough along that they believed it could not be undone. I understood that they had chosen to move forward without me because they believed I would not stop them. And most importantly, I understood that they had underestimated something essential. I turned away from them, walking toward the hallway again, my steps measured, unhurried. Behind me, I could hear them begin speaking again. their voices lowering as soon as they thought I was out of range. But I did not need to hear the words. I already knew the shape of them. Plans. Assumptions. Confidence built on the belief that I was unaware, unprepared, and perhaps unwilling to challenge what had been decided. In my room, I sat at the edge of the bed and picked up my phone once more. The contact was still there, waiting. A name from a different time, when decisions were written down clearly and nothing moved forward without a signature that meant something. I stared at it for a long moment, then finally pressed call. The line rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered, older but still steady. Hello. I did not hesitate. This is Margaret Collins, I said. I need you to look into something for me. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a tone that shifted instantly from casual to attentive. Of course, he said. What is going on? I glanced around the room, taking in every detail, every object that had been part of my life for decades. I believe someone has been making decisions in my name, I said calmly, and I would like to know exactly how far they have gone. As I ended the call a few minutes later, I felt something settle into place. Not fear, not anger, direction. Because for the first time since that email appeared on my screen, I was no longer reacting to what had already happened. I was preparing for what would happen next. And this time I would not be the last to know. The call ended, but the quiet it left behind felt different from before. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the kind that comes when a line has been drawn, even if no one else has seen it yet. I placed my phone on the nightstand and sat there for a moment, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my thoughts moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. For years, I had trusted that the people in this house spoke to me with honesty, that decisions affecting my life would include my voice, even if only out of respect. Now, I understood that assumption had been quietly replaced with something else, something more convenient for them. I stood up and walked back into the hallway, my steps steady, my expression unchanged. In the living room, Daniel and Rachel were seated close together, their heads inclined toward one another in a conversation that stopped the moment they noticed me. That had not happened before. Not like this. There had always been conversations I was not part of, but they had never needed to hide them. That was new. Everything all right? Daniel asked, his tone casual but just a little too quick. I nodded once. Everything is fine, I said. I moved past them and into the kitchen, opening the cabinet where I kept the good plates, the ones reserved for holidays and family dinners. Ran my fingers lightly along the edge of one, feeling the smooth porcelain beneath my touch. There was a time when this house had been filled with voices that did not need to lower themselves when I entered the room. A time when every decision, no matter how small, carried the understanding that we were a family, not separate pieces moving in different directions. I closed the cabinet gently and turned back toward them. We should have dinner tonight, I said. All of us. It has been a while since we sat down together. Rachel's smile returned immediately, warm and agreeable. That sounds lovely, she said. We can make something special. Daniel nodded, though his eyes flickered briefly toward her before returning to me. Carefully. Property transfer agreements. Authorization forms. They appear legitimate at first glance, but I will need to verify the signatures. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of shock, but to steady the clarity of what I was hearing. I did not sign anything, I said. I understand, he replied. That is why this is concerning. I will pull the full records and send you copies. We need to act quickly if anything is pending. Quickly. Another word to add to the collection. Thank you, I said. I will be ready. When I ended the call, I remained on the porch for a moment longer, letting the air settle around me. The world outside had not changed. The street was still quiet. The neighbors' houses stood exactly where they had always been. It was only inside these walls that things had shifted, carefully, deliberately, until I was no longer at the center of my own life. I went back inside without hesitation. Rachel was in the kitchen now, opening drawers, checking something on her phone, her movements precise. She looked up when I entered. Everything okay? She asked again, her tone light, practiced. Everything is fine, I said, meeting her eyes directly this time. And for a brief moment, something in her expression tightened. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I did. because now I was paying attention in a way I had not before. I moved past her and began preparing for dinner, taking out ingredients, setting them on the counter, moving through each step with quiet purpose. I did not rush. I did not hesitate, because tonight was not just a meal. It was a moment, a space where everything they believed was settled would begin to shift again. Only this time it would not happen without me. By the time the clock on the stove read 6:45, the house carried a different kind of tension, one that settled into the walls without making a sound. I moved through the kitchen with the same steady rhythm I had used for years, placing dishes on the table with care, aligning silverware, adjusting the napkins until everything looked as it should. There was comfort in that precision, in the familiarity of a routine that had not changed even when everything else had. Daniel returned just before 7, his footsteps heavier than they had been that morning, his expression thoughtful in a way he tried to hide. Rachel followed shortly after, her voice light as she commented on the smell of the food, her tone carrying that same practiced warmth that never quite reached her eyes. "It looks wonderful," she said, taking her seat. I nodded slightly, taking my place at the head of the table, the position I had always held without question. For a brief moment no one spoke. The quiet stretched just long enough to remind us all that this was not just another dinner. "You did not have to go through all this trouble," Daniel said finally, reaching for his glass of water. "It is not trouble," I replied. "It is what I have always done." He nodded, though his gaze drifted toward Rachel again, as if checking something unspoken between them. We began to eat, the sound of utensils against plates filling the silence that no one seemed eager to break. I watched them both carefully, not openly, but in the small ways that reveal more than direct attention ever could. The way Rachel kept her phone just within reach, her eyes flicking toward it occasionally. The way Daniel avoided certain topics, steering the conversation toward safe, neutral ground. It was all subtle, controlled, deliberate. "We should talk about the next few weeks," Rachel said at last, setting her fork down gently. There it was, the moment they had been building toward. I did not look up immediately. I took another small bite, chewed slowly, then set my own fork down with equal care. "What about them?" I asked. My voice did not change. It did not need to. Rachel folded her hands lightly in front of her, her posture composed. "There are a few arrangements we need to finalize," she said. "It would be best if we started preparing for your move soon. That way everything stays on schedule." On schedule? As if my life had become something to be managed, coordinated, adjusted to fit a timeline I had never agreed to. I lifted my gaze then, meeting hers directly. "And where exactly am I moving to?" I asked. Daniel cleared his throat softly before answering. "We found a place," he said. "A community not too far from here. It has everything you would need. Activities, support, people your age. People your age." I let the words settle between us, not reacting, not correcting, just letting them exist long enough for their meaning to become clear. "That sounds thoughtful," I said. And again I watched how they responded. Rachel's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she had been waiting for resistance that did not come. Daniel nodded, encouraged by what he believed was acceptance. "It is the best option," he said. "For everyone. For everyone. Not for me. Not for my life as it had been built here over decades, but for the version of things they had already decided would replace it." I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. "And the house?" I asked. Rachel answered this time without hesitation. "It will be taken care of," she said. "Everything has already been arranged." Already been arranged. The same quiet certainty I had seen in that email earlier that morning. I allowed a small pause, just long enough to feel its weight, then nodded once. "Of course it has," I said. For a moment no one spoke. The air shifted slightly, as if something unseen had moved into place. Daniel leaned forward, his voice softer now. "We are doing this because we care about you, Mom," he said. "We want you to be comfortable." I looked at him then, really looked, searching once more for the boy who used to ask before deciding, who used to believe that care meant inclusion, not control. He was still there, but distant now, overshadowed by the choices he had made. "I know," I said quietly. And I did. I understood exactly what they believed they were doing. I understood the story they were telling themselves to make it feel right. What they did not understand was how much I had already learned in a single day. I picked up my fork again, continuing my meal as if the conversation had reached its natural end. They followed my lead, their movements easing, their voices returning to safer topics. Small talk filling the space where something far more important had just been decided without my permission. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Because while they believed they had already secured the outcome, they had not yet realized that the ground beneath them was no longer as stable as it had been that morning. And as I sat there, finishing the dinner I had prepared in the house they thought was no longer mine, I understood one thing with complete clarity. They had already made their move. Now it was my turn. After dinner, the house did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, more careful, as if every movement carried a second meaning now. Daniel cleared the plates with a kind of efficiency that felt practiced, while Rachel wiped down the table in slow, deliberate motions, her eyes occasionally lifting toward me as if measuring something she could not quite name. I did not offer to help. That too was a change. For years I had been the one who stayed behind after meals, who made sure everything was put back exactly where it belonged. Tonight I simply stood, thanked them for dinner as if I had been the guest, and walked away. I could feel their attention follow me down the hallway, not in words but in silence. In my room I closed the door halfway, not enough to signal distance, but enough to create a space that felt like mine again. I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my laptop, the same one that had shown me the email that morning. It was still there, waiting unchanged, a quiet reminder that everything I had believed to be stable had already been set in motion without me. A few minutes later, a new message appeared. It was from the man I had spoken to earlier. Attached were copies of documents. I opened the first one slowly, my eyes moving across each line with careful attention. My name was there, printed clearly, followed by a signature that was meant to be mine. I studied it for a long moment. It looked close enough to pass at a glance, but it was not mine. There was a hesitation in the curve of the letters, a slight difference in the pressure of the pen. Someone had taken the time to imitate me, but they had not lived in my hand long enough to understand it completely. I opened the next document, then the next. The pattern was the same. Authorization forms, transfer agreements, dates that stretched back weeks, maybe longer. This had not been rushed. It had been planned. Margaret, the message read below the attachments. These filings are active. If we do not intervene, the transfer will complete within days. Within days. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I already knew. They had not just been preparing for my departure. They had been securing it. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the last of the evening light was fading, leaving the yard in a soft, muted shadow. I remembered planting that oak tree with my husband decades ago. Both of us standing in the dirt, laughing at how small it looked compared to the space it would eventually fill. He had always said that a home was not just walls and a roof. It was decisions made together, over time, each one building on the last. I wondered what he would say now, knowing that those decisions had been taken out of my hands without a word. There was a soft knock at the door, followed by Rachel's voice. "Everything okay?" she asked. I did not answer immediately. I closed the laptop gently, as if I were simply finishing something unimportant. "Yes," I said, my tone even. "Everything is fine." She stepped inside, her expression warm, her posture relaxed. "I just wanted to check on you," she said. "Today was a lot." A lot. That was one way to describe it. "I appreciate that," I replied, meeting her eyes calmly. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering briefly toward the desk before returning to my face. "We are trying to make this as easy as possible," she added. "Transitions like this can be overwhelming." I nodded slightly, as if considering her words. "I am sure they can be," I said. She smiled again, satisfied, and stepped back toward the door. "Get some rest," she said. "We have a busy few days ahead." Busy. Another word to add to the list. When she left, I remained still for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade down the hallway. Then I reached for my phone again, scrolling back to the message with the documents. My fingers moved with more certainty now, dialing the number I had called earlier. It was answered more quickly this time. Margaret, he said, his voice alert. I have reviewed everything. We need to act immediately. We will, I replied. But I want to be very clear about something first. There was a pause on the other end. Go on, he said. I looked around the room once more, at the walls, the furniture, the life that had been quietly rearranged without my consent. I am not leaving this house, I said calmly, and I am not allowing anyone to decide that for me. The silence that followed was brief, but I could hear the shift in his tone when he spoke again. Understood, he said. Then we will proceed accordingly. I ended the call and set the phone down, my mind already moving ahead, step by step, through what needed to be done. Because for the first time since this began, the situation no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something I could step into, something I could shape. They had spent weeks, maybe months, putting their plan together, believing that by the time I noticed it would be too late. What they had not considered was that I had been paying attention all along. Not to their words but to the spaces between them. And now that I understood the full picture, I was no longer standing still inside it. I was moving. The next morning arrived quietly, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do. I woke at the same time as always, the light just beginning to filter through the curtains, casting soft lines across the floor that had not changed in decades. For a moment everything felt exactly the same. The familiar rhythm of the day, the steady breath of routine. But beneath that, something else had settled in place. Not tension. Not fear. Awareness. I dressed slowly, choosing the same kind of simple outfit I always wore. Nothing that would suggest anything had shifted. When I stepped into the kitchen, Rachel was already there. Her movements precise, her expression calm. She looked up and smiled. Good morning, she said, her tone light. I was just making coffee. I nodded, taking my usual place by the counter. Thank you, I replied. She handed me a cup, her fingers brushing mine briefly, her gaze searching my face for something I did not give her. Did you sleep well? She asked. I did, I said. And that was true. For the first time in a long while, my mind had not been restless. It had been focused. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his presence filling the room with a familiar weight. Morning, he said, glancing between us before reaching for his own cup. There was a moment of quiet, the kind that used to feel comfortable but now carried a different meaning. We have a meeting later today, Rachel said, setting her cup down. Just to go over the final steps. Final steps. I let the words pass without reaction. That sounds important, I said. Daniel nodded, his tone careful. It is just paperwork, he said. Nothing complicated. Nothing complicated. I almost smiled at that. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle before I spoke again. I have a few things to take care of today as well, I said. Rachel's eyes flickered slightly. Oh, she asked. Just some old matters I have been meaning to organize, I replied. It has been a while since I reviewed everything. There was a brief pause, subtle but noticeable. Daniel shifted his weight, setting his cup down with a little more force than necessary. That is a good idea, he said. Staying organized helps. Helps. I nodded once, then set my cup aside. I will be out for a bit this morning, I added. Do not wait on me. Rachel's smile returned, smooth and composed. Of course, she said. Take your time. I left the house a few minutes later, stepping into the cool morning air with a sense of clarity that had not been there before. The driveway looked the same. The street was quiet. Nothing outside had changed. But I had. I drove to the office I had not visited in years, the building standing exactly where I remembered, its exterior unchanged by time. When I stepped inside, the receptionist looked up, her expression polite, then surprised as recognition settled in. Mrs. Collins, she said. I nodded. I have an appointment, I replied. A few minutes later, I was seated across from the man who had handled my husband's affairs for decades, his presence steady, his attention sharp. He spread the documents out in front of us, each page a piece of something that had been built without my consent. These filings are real, he said, but they are not legitimate. I looked at the signatures again, the careful imitation, the small imperfections that gave them away. Can it be stopped? I asked. He nodded. Yes, he said. But we need to act immediately. We will file a formal challenge, freeze any pending transfers, and notify all parties involved. Notify all parties. I considered that for a moment, then shook my head slightly. Not yet, I said. He looked at me, his expression questioning. If we move too quickly, they will know, I continued. And I want to see how far they are willing to go. There was a brief silence, then a slow nod. Understood, he said. We can proceed carefully. Carefully. That word felt different now. Not something they controlled, but something I chose. We spent the next hour going through every detail, every document, every step that had been taken in my name. By the time I left, I had copies of everything, along with a plan that no longer left me on the outside of my own life. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. Rachel's car was in the driveway, Daniel's was not. I stepped inside, setting my bag down in the hallway before moving through the rooms with a steady pace. Nothing had changed since I left. Or perhaps everything had, but I could see it now. I walked into the living room and noticed the stack of papers still sitting on the coffee table. This time I picked them up. My name appeared again, printed clearly, attached to decisions I had never made. I set them back down exactly where they had been, aligning the edges with precision. Then I stepped back, looking at the room as a whole. They believed this was already theirs to control. They believed the outcome had been secured. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed I would remain where they left me. And as I stood there, in the center of a house they thought I was about to lose, I understood something with complete certainty. They were not watching closely enough. And that was exactly where I would begin. When Rachel returned later that afternoon, she carried herself with the same quiet confidence she had shown all day. But there was something slightly sharper in the way her eyes moved through the room, as if she were checking for changes she could not quite define. I was seated in the living room, a book open in my lap, my posture relaxed, my attention seemingly fixed on the page. In reality, I had not turned a single page in the last 20 minutes. I listened instead. The sound of her heels against the hardwood floor. The soft click of her phone unlocking. The brief pause when she noticed me sitting there. Exactly where I always Saturday you are back, she said, her tone light but measured. I looked up, offering a small familiar smile. I am, I replied. It was a productive morning. She nodded, stepping further into the room, her gaze drifting briefly to the coffee table before returning to me. That is good, she said. We have been making progress here as well. Progress. I closed the book gently, setting it aside. I can see that, I said. And I could. Not because anything obvious had changed, but because I now understood what I was looking at. The arrangement of papers. The placement of objects. The subtle shifts that had once felt random now formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Daniel arrived shortly after, his energy slightly different from the morning, more focused, more certain. We finalized a few things today, he said as he stepped into the room, his voice carrying a quiet sense of accomplishment. I nodded once, as if that was exactly what I expected to hear. That must feel good, I said. He smiled, relieved by my response, by the absence of resistance he had likely been preparing for. It does, he said. Everything is coming together. Everything is coming together. I let the words settle, then leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. That reminds me, I said. I took some time today to review a few things myself. The effect was immediate, though subtle. Rachel's posture straightened just slightly. Daniel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Before returning, "Oh," he said. "Just old documents," I replied. "It has been a while since I looked at them." Rachel stepped closer, her tone still smooth. "You did not need to worry about that," she said. "We have everything under control." I met her eyes, holding her gaze just long enough to let the moment stretch. "I am sure you believe that," I said quietly. The room shifted then, not visibly, but in a way that could be felt. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mom," he said, "we are trying to make this easy for you." I nodded, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "I understand what you are trying to do," I said. "Truly." And I did. I understood the structure of their plan, the careful steps, the quiet confidence that had allowed them to move forward without question. What they did not understand was that I had already stepped outside of it. I stood from my chair, moving toward the window once more, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. There is something else, I added. I made a few calls today. This time, neither of them spoke immediately. The silence held, heavier now, more deliberate. Calls? Rachel asked finally, her voice controlled. I turned slightly, enough to see them both without fully facing them. Yes, I said. To make sure everything is as it should be. Daniel's expression tightened, just enough to reveal the edge beneath his calm. There is no need for that, he said. We already handled everything. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. That is what I wanted to confirm, I replied. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. Rachel stepped forward again, her composure still intact, but her movements more precise now, less relaxed. And what did you find? She asked. I allowed a small pause, just long enough to let the question settle between us. I found that things are further along than I expected, I said. That was true, just not in the way they assumed. Daniel exhaled softly, as if releasing tension he had been holding. Then you see why this is the right decision, he said. I did not respond right away. Instead, I turned fully toward them, my expression calm, my voice steady. I see that. Decisions have been made, I said. Without me. The words hung in the air, quiet but unmistakable. Rachel's smile returned, but it was different now, tighter, more controlled. We did what we thought was best, she said. I nodded once. I believe you did, I replied. And I did believe that. What I did not believe was that their definition of best would remain unchallenged. I walked past them then, moving toward the hallway, my steps unhurried, my posture unchanged. Behind me, I could feel their attention sharpen, their certainty beginning to shift into something else. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. The same awareness that had settled into me the morning before. And as I reached my room, closing the door softly behind me, I understood that the balance had changed. They were no longer the only ones moving pieces across the board. And the next move would not be theirs. The following morning did not begin with questions. It began with certainty. I moved through the house as I always had, but this time every step felt deliberate, every movement placed exactly where I intended it to be. Daniel was already in the kitchen, his phone in hand, his expression focused in a way that told me he had been waiting for something. Rachel stood by the counter, her posture composed, but there was a tightness in her shoulders that had not been there before. They both looked up when I entered, their attention settling on me at the same time. Good morning, Daniel said, his voice steady but careful. Good morning, I replied, taking my usual seat without hesitation. There was no small talk this time. No attempt to soften what was already building beneath the surface. Rachel set her phone down slowly. We should go over the final paperwork today, she said. There are just a few signatures left. I folded my hands in front of me, resting them lightly on the table. That will not be necessary, I said. The words were quiet, but they did not need to be anything else. The effect was immediate. Daniel's expression shifted, confusion surfacing before he could mask it. What do you mean? He asked. I met his gaze directly, my voice calm, unwavering. I mean there will be no more paperwork, I said. Not for this. Rachel stepped forward, her composure tightening into something sharper. Margaret, she said, her tone controlled. Everything has already been arranged. We are just completing the process. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said. I am aware of what has been arranged. I reached into my bag then, removing a folder and placing it carefully on the table between us. The sound of it touching the surface was soft, but it carried weight. Daniel looked down at it, then back at me. What is that? He asked. The same documents you have been working with, I replied. Only these have been reviewed. Rachel's hand moved toward the folder, but she hesitated just before touching it, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she already understood more than she wanted to admit. Daniel opened it first, his movements slower now, less certain. As he read, I watched the change happen. Not all at once. Piece by piece. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. Rachel leaned in, scanning the pages, her expression shifting from confidence to calculation, then to something quieter. Something closer to realization. This does not make sense, Daniel said finally, his voice lower than before. It does, I replied. You are looking at the same filings, the same signatures, the same timeline. Rachel closed the folder gently, her fingers lingering on the edge. These can be challenged, she said. That does not change what has already been set in motion. I held her gaze steady and unyielding. It changes everything, I said. The room fell silent. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the kind that comes when something undeniable has been placed in the center of it. Daniel looked at me again, searching, as if trying to find the version of me he believed he understood. Mom, he said, his voice softer now, uncertain. We were trying to help. I nodded once. I know, I said. And I have taken that into consideration. Rachel straightened, her composure returning in a different form, more guarded now, less certain of its ground. Then you understand why this is necessary, she said. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I leaned back slightly, my hands resting calmly in my lap. What I understand, I said slowly, is that decisions were made in my name without my consent. The words settled into the space between us, clear and final. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair, the certainty he had carried now fractured by something he could not easily dismiss. So what happens now? He asked. I looked at him for a moment, then at Rachel, then back at the house around us. The walls, the table, the space that had been quietly taken apart and rearranged without me. Now, I said, my voice even, everything stops. Rachel's expression hardened slightly. You cannot just stop this, she said. There are processes in place. I allowed a small pause, just long enough to let the weight of what I was about to say settle before the words arrived. There are, I agreed. And they are already being handled. Daniel's head lifted slightly. What does that mean? He asked. I met his gaze one last time, steady, composed, completely certain. It means, I said, that nothing moves forward without my authorization. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was no longer built on assumption or control. It was built on the understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Not quietly, not without notice, but completely. I stood then, gathering the folder and closing it with care, my movements calm, unhurried. You thought everything had already been decided, I said, my voice steady as I turned toward the hallway. But you forgot something important. I paused just long enough for them to feel it. This was never yours to decide. And as I walked away, leaving them standing there with the weight of what they had set in motion now turning back toward them, I understood something with complete clarity. They had believed I was the last to know. They had been wrong.